Cate Shanahan, MD, is a New York Times bestselling author of Deep Nutrition as well as The Fat Burn Fix, and she's had a huge impact on today's food and health landscapes. What an ideal human diet looks like, and the damaging effects of a collection of 8 common seed oils that you will know that she calls the Hateful 8.
People in Hawaii did not have those. Like they didn't exist on Hawaii for the most part, because most people in Hawaii, the reason it was this window into what human health is supposed to look like and just how amazingly healthy people stay into their elderly years when they avoid these oils, because they simply weren't on the island.
And I really looked at the idea of dietary fat because, in our growing up in education, fat was foe. Fat was the enemy, and people were on the lowest possible fat of any kind they could be. When did vegetable oils, enter the lexicon or enter the marketplace? And let's talk about the history of their development.
So the history of these oils goes back to the late 1800s when there was this industrial revolution, and chemists had really learned how to manipulate molecules to turn them into things that they wanted. And so the original entry of all vegetable oils into the food supply came in the form of cottonseed oil. And it was Procter & Gamble, a company Procter & Gamble, which was mainly a candle company that had diversified into soap because of electricity. And then in trying to turn these cotton seeds into some sort of profitable income stream, they extracted the oil from cotton seeds, which were, and this is important, totally a waste product of the cotton, the textiles industry, right? So it was free. So it was like free for the taking, basically. Nobody knew what to do with them. They tried feeding them to animals, but they had a toxin in them, so they couldn't do that. So they left it up to the chemists to come to the rescue. And they figured out how to kind of harden these liquid oils and remove the toxic compound in this massively intense processing. They just totally chemically changed it, and they turned it into something nothing like the original oil. It was kind of a semi-solid. It looked like large, so they sold it as a large substitute, and that was how Crisco entered our food supply. But it was a solid.
What is the threat that these seed oils are posing that then leads to the obvious disease states that are becoming so prevalent?
This is the critical question. What exactly about these oils makes them toxic to our health? The core fatty acid molecules that something like a soybean are made out of, or canola oil, those fatty acid molecules are actually essential fatty acids, and they would be good for us. Like if we just eat soybeans or sunflower seeds, those fatty acids are perfectly fine. But what the processing does is it turns the normal healthy fatty acids that our cell membranes are supposed to be made out of in a good amount, actually. Our cell membranes need a lot of these. Something around 30 to 40% of all the fatty acids in our cell membranes are supposed to come from these special kinds of fatty acids that we can only get from our diet. So we do need to eat them. So the dietitians are right about that. But where the dietitians are absolutely wrong is the toxicity of the oil as it leaves the factory. And the key question, the key talking point here is toxins form out of those special molecules we need called polyunsaturated fatty acid molecules. They form out of those. And to give you a visual, let's say you have a glass in your hand. That is a useful thing, but it's fragile. A polyunsaturated fatty acid is a useful thing, but it's fragile. And during the processing and refining, taking it out of the seed and then cleaning up the messy oil that you get, the way they process these oils is very intensive. It breaks that big molecule. So it's like shattering the piece of glass. And the toxins are like the shards of glass. So they formed from the molecule. And so a lot of people don't realize, but when you have something like a canola oil, right? A lot of people are confused about canola oil. So I want to talk a tiny bit about that because it drives these points home. Canola oil is often labeled as healthy because it has been expeller, extracted, no hexane, and it's organic. But the problem that canola has is even when you cold press it and don't use hexane, those breakable polyunsaturated fatty acids have turned into toxins. And so the crude canola oil is not an edible oil. And that's really the key. The thing is not edible. Like olive oil is edible. The minute you make olive oil, it's called extra virgin olive oil. That's the crude olive oil. We don't call it crude olive oil. We call it extra virgin. But we call canola and soy and etc., the other hateful eight, we call that crude oil because it tells you something important, that word. It's inedible. It needs to be refined in order to not be disgusting and to clean up a lot of the toxins. But the thing is, it can't clean up all the toxins. It's just too many. The polyunsaturated fatty acids, there's so many of them in these particular types of oils. And they
wasn't canola originally developed as an industrial oil?
Yes, it was. And it was actually a machine oil developed for the war effort, World War II effort in Canada. Yeah. And so after the war was over, they're like, okay, well, why don't we just make sure that this, let's clean it up just a little bit better and then, see if we can sell it to people. And they managed to sell it to people. They didn't die immediately. They didn't, they accepted it. It was never tested though. It was a new substance. And back at this point in time, there were not the kind of regulations on a new substance in any country.
That these oils that appear on our grocery store shelves are absolutely threatening Americans' health. How have you been received?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's actually, there's been a lot of pushback, as you might imagine. But it's mostly pushback coming from the medical industry.
Really?
Yes. There are lots of medical doctors out there who are standing up for canola oil and standing up for, the idea that these polyunsaturated oils are heart healthy. And they're from extremely prestigious institutions.
But how does that make you feel when you see that doctors who are learning incredibly minimal amounts of nutritional information anyway are not getting the story on the refined carbohydrates or the seed oils?
Yeah, so I want to answer that question, but first, what you brought up was a very important kind of misperception. It's critical to understanding this whole argument.
I think it's the omega-6 part, right?
Yes,
I knew you were going to get that.
Yeah, because the problem is that the toxins, like those shards of glass, they damage the cell membranes. So it's not that we have an imbalance or too much. A lot of people are talking about too much omega-6, and that could be part of the problem. But I think it's 95% the fact that these toxins actually multiply, and they are self-multiplying toxins. And when you buy a bottle of soy oil or canola oil, there's trace amounts of toxins in there, but they multiply and multiply and multiply, and then they attack our cell membranes. And so that's the real problem, and it matters a lot. It's not just an academic conversation that we're having.
The increased risk of oxidation in terms of the polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs, that because they are unsaturated, and we have to talk about what that means, in comparison to saturated fat, that they are at a higher risk for being damaged by free radical type chemicals, oxidized. And then talk about it in the context of risk for oxidative damage.
So the chemistry is really, I think it's the fun part, but it kind of makes a lot of people's heads spin. So let's just talk about this kind of in stick figure simply. We'll try to, imagine this, right? So saturated fat is a straight line molecule, and unsaturated fat is not straight. It has a kink in it. And we know saturated fats are solid, like butter is solid at room temperature. And we know oils are liquid at room temperature. They don't have as much saturated fat. They have more of those kinky fats that are bendy. And those kinks and bends, they come from what's called a double chemical bond or double bond. And those bonds are weaker and they attract oxygen. And that's where oxygen, which is everywhere in the air, when we cook our food, it's in the factory, it's in our bloodstream. So it's very important to consider how oxygen reacts with different fatty acids. And oxygen will attack the fatty acids that are in seed oils because they have 2 double bonds or 3 double bonds. And that makes them especially dangerous in terms of toxicity because oxygen breaks the molecule. So think of oxygen like in that analogy of the glass. The polyunsaturates are the glass, the fragile glass, and oxygen is like this sledgehammer that comes along and smashes polyunsaturates into all different chemical shards that are each one an individual toxin. So there's a huge disconnect between what doctors learn and what chemists and scientists studying these oils and studying saturated fats talk about. The disconnect is on multiple levels. So doctors are listening to one crowd of people, and the doctors are listening to dietitians, basically. Dietitians who create, clinical trials, who themselves are dyed-in-the-wool believers that saturated fat is bad and that these polyunsaturates are like the answer to all of our health problems fat-wise. So that the doctors are really only listening to a tiny sliver of the people producing the research, right? The other people are absolutely disconnected from the medical stream of knowledge. It's like there's a narrative in medicine, saturated fat is bad. Saturated fat is bad. And they literally plug their ears and do not listen to people who are producing evidence against that narrative. Let's give you some examples. It's toxicologists who study the oil themselves. It's pathologists who study the pathophysiology of diseases like Alzheimer's. Where do those plaques and tangles come from? Oh, it's oxidative stress. Gee, that sounds familiar. That sounds like oxidation, what we've just been talking about. This idea in human history is this idea that cholesterol causes heart attacks. It was not true. It was never true. It was never proven, yet it was accepted as fact. And it's ridiculous when you think about it a little bit because cholesterol is something nature puts in every single one of our cells. It is essential to life, to animal life. All animals, not just humans, every form of animal must have cholesterol in our cell membrane. And if the cell doesn't have enough, it can die. If ovarian cells and the cells of our, the cells that are baby making cells, if they don't have enough cholesterol, we won't reproduce. Men will be infertile, women will not ovulate. Cholesterol is a very important nutrient. It's important for our brain, which is 15% cholesterol by weight. And yet, the American Heart Association, who are the evil organization, they're a dark organization. They're the source of this supposed information, supposed, idea that cholesterol is a toxin clogging our arteries. Cholesterol is in our arteries for a reason. And when people have more cholesterol, all their other biomarkers are better. And we're finding out now when people have higher cholesterol levels, they have cleaner arteries with lower calcium scores than people with lower cholesterol. Doctors going through training, dietitians going through training, nurses, people who mean well, people who want to heal, their good intentions are being hijacked by largely the American Heart Association, the dark, evil organization. They've exported all these diseases now around the globe, and they're responsible for billions of deaths.
I think what's happened is our belief systems, and you talk about this in the book too, our belief systems have been hijacked with these various narratives that do not serve us.